przyszli.
After the 10th of April 2010, the Military Counterintelligence Service began to cooperate with the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. Since the beginning of 2011, the service had been recording the entry of representatives of the Russian Federal Security Service, the successor to the KGB, into the headquarters of the Polish counterintelligence. Colonel Vladimir Jóźwik from the Federal Security Service was at the SKW headquarters very often, and one might say too often. We can even count how many times it was. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Before the head of the Polish counterintelligence asked Donald Tusk for permission to sign an agreement with the FSB, people from this service, Russians, visited the headquarters of the Polish military counterintelligence 14 times, and until the agreement was signed in 2013, a total of over 64 times. 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. In September 2013 in St. Petersburg, the Polish and the Russian counterintelligence signed an agreement. The parties provide each other with assistance in the following main areas of cooperation in the field of military counterintelligence, counteracting intelligence, and subversive activities on special services of third countries directed against the Russian Federation or the Republic of Poland. Interestingly, after signing the agreement, the frequency of the meetings decreased. Only 11 of them took place, of which 5 after the Russian attack on Ukraine, already after the annexation of Crimea in February 2014. What was the total number of visits? Hard to say. However, it is known how many entries in the Book of Entrances have been recorded. 74. He was there 75 times, representatives of the FSB. During what period? From 2001 to 2014. 2011 to 2014, 3 years. They pushed it all the way, already after the war. But wait a minute, 30th December 2014, there is a war in Ukraine. Crimea was occupied. In January 2014, the first security note was written in the military counterintelligence, stating that everything they did with them was a Russian intelligence game. But they saw through it and also played their game with the Russians. And as part of the game, they invited him to their New Year's Eve party. That's a lot. Little, ordinary. We're talking about counterintelligence. Perhaps it is neither a lot nor little. But what matters is who it was and who they contacted. One thing is certain, a shocking number of meetings. I would love to see a similar summary of contacts with allies. Were there equally intense contacts, especially in 2011? If they were preparing an agreement, why so many meetings? An agreement between the services is prepared in 3 to 4 meetings, and here we have several dozen meetings. In fact, if we look at all these pieces of paper and what this preparation of agreement, there is something wrong. The data on meetings between the Federal Security Service and the Military Counterintelligence Service come from official reports, which were created years later in the Military Counterintelligence Service, and from the analysis of documents available at the Chancellery of the Prime Minister. It is simply, as I said, impossible to meet, let's say officially, these 5 representatives of the FSB who have been to the SKW headquarters on Ochiki Street 100 times in total. There are no official notes from any of these meetings. None of these meetings was, apart from the record of entering the building, recorded as it should be in some information, in some note, which should be addressed to the Minister of National Defense, who, under the Act, is the supervisor of the military services, including the Military Counterintelligence Service. Nothing like that happened. I also looked for these materials in the materials addressed from the Military Counterintelligence Service to the Minister of National Defense. During those meetings, there must have been the exchange of some information. And I think that, for example, the provision of the agreement between the SKW and the FSB from September 2013, which states that information can be transferred to each other in writing or verbally, says a lot in this matter. The meeting of Polish officers with the Russians aroused so much controversy within the services that the information about them began to reach the then opposition politicians involved in the secret services. In 2012 to 2013, a series of parliamentary interpellations regarding these relations was submitted. In response to the questions about the reasons and basis for such contacts, Minister of National Defense Tomasz Siemionak and Deputy Minister of National Defense Czesław Mroczek provided answers which, in the light of the disclosed recordings, for example, the one from the meeting in Kadynia, were clearly untrue. All meetings organized as part of cooperation with representatives of special services of other countries which take place in the facilities of the Military Counterintelligence Service are held in separate reception rooms in compliance with safety rules. Therefore, representatives of foreign service delegations are not allowed to enter protection zones where classified information is processed. Minister Mroczek, Deputy Minister of National Defense, wrote that meetings with Russians were not and are not taking place in security zones, i.e. in places where classified information is processed. I'm sorry, but Colonel Jóźwik entries into the office of the head of the service. This is entering the zone. It can be said that entering the building of the Military Counterintelligence Service is entering a zone. In fact, you cannot walk freely around the building of the Military Counterintelligence Service, like any other service. Even someone who works there does not have a magic card that can open all doors and let him in everywhere. So it's just a misunderstanding. Each such meeting should be ended or summarized with an appropriate note. What was the course of the meeting? What did the Russian side say? What demands did it make? What is the schedule for subsequent contacts? Nothing like this happened. Mroczek doesn't say anything about it, but he does say that there were no meetings organized in the security zone and outside the buildings, apart from the buildings of the Military Counterintelligence Service. The SKW did not explain the nature of the agreement signed by the Military Counterintelligence with the service of the Russian Federation, the FSB, in 2013. Is this agreement still in force? What are the effects of this agreement, and has it been abandoned? No one informed us about checking what information was provided to the Russian side. The parliamentary questions also included issues regarding previous decisions made by the secret services regarding Messrs. Pytel and Nosek. These questions concerned the circumstances of their departure from the State Protection Office and later from the Internal Security Agency at the earlier stages of their service. The MPs asking about these matters were interested in whether the heads of the services who decided to cooperate with the FSB had previously had problems obtaining security clearance. The Ministry of National Defense rejected the possibility. I would like to inform you that 2 verification procedures were carried out regarding Piotr Pytel, which ended with the issuance of a security clearance authorizing access to classified information, marked as top secret. The Internal Security Agency informed that it did not have information that would confirm that Piotr Pytel, during his service in the UOP and the ABW, had been in possession of any information that could constitute the basis for his dismissal from service or that would indicate that he did not guarantee secrecy. As a result of the review of the files of the above-mentioned officer carried out at the Military Counterintelligence Service and the Internal Security Agency, it can be concluded that there were no objections regarding the course of his service. My skeptical, some might say naive, scientific attitude told me up to a certain point that this was probably an exaggerated accusation. All those stories about the past of Pytel and Nosik's service in the State Protection Office and the Internal Security Agency. However, when I read the answer prepared at the Ministry of National Defense for the signature of Deputy Minister Mroczek in May 2013, this is the answer regarding, one could say, most of the questions in this part, in this area regarding contacts between the SKW and the FSB. And I must say that it is simply completely false, completely contrary to everything that was happening in the military counterintelligence service at that time. The nature and recording the content of these meetings was subject to some kind of game within the special service. In the films, we know from Kadin, in those parts, in those images that seem less interesting because they show, so to speak, packing one's bags in the restaurant itself, in casinos, there appear figures of officers who work in operational departments until today. This in itself is simply amazing that they were exposed in such a trivial way. I mean, wait, I'll interrupt you so I can understand it better. We reviewed and analysed these recordings in detail. What does it mean? There are at least a few things there that I don't understand. The presence of these people is one thing, and in itself somehow puzzling. Well, for example, we clearly have a man who is at least dressed like a waiter, who at some point tapes over the surveillance cameras, and a camera which also recorded everything that was happening. Yes, because this is amazing when it comes to meeting Russian FSB officers in Kadin. It is protected widely, in a broad sense, from the culinary and alcohol perspective, by technology. It is secured as if in partnership with the Military Counterintelligence Service and the waiter service of the restaurant in Kadin. That is, on the one hand, the room was wired by officers and even SKW officers, and on the other hand, from the video recording side, waiters were involved, and of course there is the question whether it was harmonious cooperation, or whether everyone, so to speak, acted on their own. And what has happened with these recordings? We reached them. It wasn't easy, but we reached them. But the question is, how many unauthorized persons, because we are authorized, of course, got access to this type of material, and what happened to the recording of this meeting, which was conducted or implemented by the military counterintelligence services? But wait, there's a fundamental question about this whole thing. Yes, it is a fundamental question. Where are these materials? That is, where is the recording made with this technique? Well, I'll ask this question directly. Maybe there are simply in the archives of the Military Counterintelligence Service. Maybe everything is fine. Maybe they were just carrying out activities to be recognized. They made the recordings, secured them, handed them over to the Military Counterintelligence Service, analyzed them, and they are fine. My knowledge tells me that these materials are not available in the Military Counterintelligence Service. And the records that we showed in one of the episodes, and the reaction to all this, people in the secret services confirm all this, which means that these are unknown materials to them. But to understand it, because it is very interesting, Kadynie are, so to speak, in the territory within the scope of operation of the SKW Gdynia Inspectorate. Elbląg and the local SKW unit are subordinated to the Gdynia Inspectorate. Hence, the head of the Gdynia SKW Inspectorate, i.e., the commander, participates in the meetings with the Russians, which is reprehensible in itself. The operational security of this meeting, the pickup, probably the indication of the place to have a formal meal with the Russians, all this was the responsibility of the Gdynia Inspectorate and the Elbląg unit of the Military Counterintelligence Service. In the light of the answers to the parliamentary interpellation given by Minister Siemionak and Minister Mroczek, which are clearly contradictory to the facts we know today, it is worth considering once again the sense of signing the agreement between the FSB and SKW. The idea was to include something in the agreement that would make it possible, in the event of any post-factum counterintelligence investigative proceedings, checking of what was going on, that we could say, well, because we had such an agreement and it follows from it that we can do it. It is naive to assume that someone who wants to seriously investigate the nature of these contacts will be satisfied with the fact that we are shared already some information with each other as part of our cooperation. This is extremely naive in my opinion. It stinks from a mile away. But you don't. I'm sorry to tell you this, but I don't think you understand the mentality of the people who created the secret services at that time. Or, in other words, who created the entire political system, led by Donald Tusk and Bronisław Komorowski. These are people, and this belief is present among them today, who believe that right-wing governments in Poland are always temporary governments. They own Poland. They own the secret services. And all those moments where for 4 years, for 8 years, or, please God, 12 years, someone else enters these offices, then, from their perspective, he only temporarily takes their place. But they are the owners of these institutions. They own Poland. The information we have obtained, which is in the resources of Polish state institutions, shows that it is possible that the first meetings between representatives of the FSB and the Military Counterintelligence Service took place as early as in 2009. This was claimed by the PMs who were interested in this matter. Official documents regarding the Smolensk investigation also show that immediately after the 10th of April, the Military Counterintelligence Service received information from the FSB of Russia, and that contacts between these services were maintained from April to December 2010. Official visits of the FSB to the Military Counterintelligence Service in the Book of Entries and Exits of this institution have been registered since January 2011. Meetings were held even several times a month. They continued throughout 2011 until, on the 17th of October 2011, General Janusz Nosek officially asked Donald Tusk for his consent to establish cooperation. From the moment Donald Tusk wrote, "I consent," by his own hand to the signing of the agreement, another 2 years passed because the agreement in St. Petersburg was signed in September 2013. Throughout this period, representatives of the Russian secret services came to the Military Counterintelligence Service once a week, sometimes more often. After signing the agreement, the meetings continued until the end of 2014. The last one was registered on December the 30th that year. On the 20th of February 2014, the Russian Federation started an undeclared war with Russia, occupying Crimea. From that moment on, the Western world placed sanctions on the Russian Federation. The meetings between the FSB and the SKW continued despite everything. On the 21st of January 2015, Deputy Minister of National Defense, Robert Kupiecki, issued an order that representatives of the Russian Federation are prohibited from entering the buildings of the Ministry of National Defense. Years later, history added a postscript to the whole story about the SKW people who, for almost 5 years, built their direct relations with the Russians from the FSB, a service that is a continuation of the KGB. Before the change of government in Poland, the same group of officers who created the reset in the secret services tried to establish themselves in the new structure within the Ministry of National Defense in the so-called NATO Counterintelligence Center of Expertise. Apparently, the group of these officers assumed that their strength would be large enough to remain inside Poland's intelligence and counterintelligence structures after the change of government. The NATO Counterintelligence Center of Expertise was not a NATO CEK, but a reset readout, or, in other words, a readout of resetters from the SKW. Exactly those who maintained close contacts with the Russians and signed an agreement with them in September 2013. Yes, they took various types of evidence of their contacts with the Russians there, and the fact that this gang was driven out from there was simply a great success of the Minister of Antony Macierewicz. It just had to happen. The takeover of the offices of the NATO Counterintelligence Center of Expertise sparked a furious reaction from the media and politicians in Poland, even though this action was necessary for the Polish state to regain control over the key Polish counterintelligence and intelligence structures. This is disastrous in terms of image. Such signals are completely incomprehensible. Probably in the whole history of NATO, there has never been a case where a member country attacked a NATO facility. Representatives of Minister Macierewicz broke down the door and captured the NATO Counterintelligence Center of Expertise. NATO issued a special statement on this matter. We read there, among other things, that the Polish-Slovak Center is not a body of the alliance. The way this was carried out is absolutely outrageous. This did not mean any standards of the NATO countries in the European Union. For 8 years, they operated within the military counterintelligence structures and cooperated bilaterally and multilaterally with NATO. And suddenly, we send a signal to our NATO allies. These gentlemen who cooperated with you are at worst traitors. Among the artifacts and compromising photos, bottles and FSB logos, something else was found in the safes. Adrian Stankowski described it in his article in the Gazeta Polska Codziennie Daily. Printouts of the parliamentary interpellations, but interestingly without the names of the MPs who submitted them. In the place where the MP's name was supposed to appear, there were only dots waiting for the name to be entered. In the CEK safes, apart from the FSB emblems, vodka bottles, photos from trips to St. Petersburg, Baltisk and Moscow, there was also something shocking: blank parliamentary interpellations, which were later submitted by, among others, MP Brejza and MP Biernacki. Interpellations regarding such issues from everyday life, like fleet cards or entry to the parking lot. Well, such mundane matters of the reset people. But I have the impression that it says a lot about such blank interpellations were submitted to the Sejm. And we know that the interpellations were submitted. They had their own people in the Sejm who dealt with the matters. The question is, what was the content of these interpellations? That they concerned, in fact, semi-private matters, i.e. some minor issues related to their lost position in the military counterintelligence service, because that is what some issues concern, related to car parking. This all shows the mentality of this group. It was even more important to simply remove them from there.
Usunięcie ich stamtąd było niezwykle ważne.
Searching for the same content that was included in the interpolations projects found in the CEK NATO safes brings surprising results. It turns out that an interpolation identical to the one found in the safes of this institution was submitted by Krzysztof Brzezia, a member of the Sejm of the Republic of Poland. His interpolation is still available in the same databases. This whole story of defending the CEK NATO was accompanied by an attempt to reach not only politicians, not only civic platform politicians, Brazia MPs or former platformer Marek Biernacki, but also an attempt to reach officials already associated with the government of the United Right. Colonel Krzysztof Dusza, one of the legendary resetters, whose family background was in the military counterintelligence service, as his wife, Inga Susza, also worked at the SKW. Fortunately, he no longer works in the military counterintelligence service. Krzysztof Dusza also tried to reach the officials of the Chancellery of the President. He wrote a memorandum in which he threatened Poland with a great image disaster if he and Pytel were expelled from the NATO CEK. And I must admit that some people believed that there could be a great international scandal if such outstanding soldiers, if such outstanding counterintelligence experts from NATO Counterintelligence Center of Expertise were removed. So, it's like they're trying to reach out to different politicians. Both the right wing, which was already in power at that time, and the opposition in order to defend their position. Well, it just shows who we're dealing with. At the same time as the bilateral meetings of the FSB, SKW in Poland, preparations for the next visit of a high representative of the Russian Federation to our country began. After Vladimir Putin's visit on the 1st of September 2009 and Dmitry Medvedev's visit in April and December 2010, the next representative of the structure that have secretly ruling Russia for years was to be a priest. Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia. Since the early 1970s, he has been agent of the Russian KGB. The visit will take place at the invitation of the Metropolitan Sava, the head of the Orthodox Church in Poland. This will be the first bilateral visit to the Republic of Poland of the Patriarch of Moscow, the head of the Orthodox Church in Russia. It is planned for the 16th to 19th of August 2012. According to information obtained by the Eastern Department, the guest's intention, agreed with the President Dmitry Medvedev and Metropolitan Sava, apart from the church goals of the visit, is also to support the current Polish-Russian dialogue. Kirill is not only the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, but also a man of the KGB, the FSB, a man of the services. There is more to be said. Cyril is, first and foremost, a Leningradian, a representative of the St. Petersburg power elite, so close, so strongly created by Vladimir Putin. Let's just note, all the most important people, Putin, Patrushev, Kirill, Narzhikin, and many, many others. These are people coming from Leningrad. And so it is with Cyril. Cyril studied at the Leningrad Theological Seminary in the 1960s. In the 1970s, he became a bishop. Kirill, since 1989 until he became a patriarch of Moscow and all Russia in 2009, a long time ago, headed, one might say, the diplomacy of the Moscow Patriarchate, becoming the chairman and head of the Department of Foreign Church Affairs of the Moscow Patriarchate. In fact, from the very beginning, this department, one could say, of foreign affairs of the Moscow Patriarchate, from which, moreover, very often come these communist, post-communist Moscow patriarchs. And here, Cyril is no exception. It was always the KGB, and today it is the FSB.
To była zawsze jaczejka KGB, a dziś to jest jaczejka FSB.
The Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs was fully aware of who the Polish officials were to meet. As part of the Sendesmos organization, the global brotherhood of Orthodox Church youth organizations, he visited Prague. Some sources say that he was recruited by the KGB before leaving. Alternative variants appear that what shall we do if the problem of the KGB past of Kirill appears? What will we do then?
Pojawiają się jakby wytłumaczenia czy suflowane opinie,
And there appear explanations or prompted opinions that must, on the one hand, arouse disgust, and on the other hand, there must be a smile here, because it says that in such situations, when it appears, God forbid, during Cyril's visit, we need to soften it by saying that we know that also in Poland, the lustration and instigators do a lot of harm, and in fact we should agree. Mr. Cyril on this issue that we should first beat our own chest, first and only then examine the second, third or fourth person. Sensitive matters with suggestive reactions, collaboration with the KGB in the Soviet past of Kirill and his patron, Metropolitan Nikodem. Let everyone beat their own chests, because we know what a terrible image and problems result from the passion for lustration in all countries, including Poland. Cyril's visit to Poland was part of a series of earlier visits by both Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev, the aim of which was to commemorate the soldiers of the Soviet army that invaded Poland several times in the 20th century. In the above-mentioned context, the following political goals and tasks emerge: reconciliation at the graves of the victims of the Bolshevik-Polish War, and a visit in the temporal context of the 15th of August holiday.
Jest tam również mowa o tym, że polska strona zobowiąże się w czasie rozmowy.
It is also mentioned that the Polish side will undertake, during the conversation with Cyril, that the Polish authorities will conduct such an internal policy in Poland that, in some sense, will reformat the negative attitudes of Poles towards the Red Army, showing positive sides related to extraordinary heroism and the process of liberating Poles from the German occupation in the documents of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Procesem wyzwalania Polaków spod okupacji niemieckiej w dokumentach MSZ, oni w kontekście wizyty Cyryla.
In the context of Cyril's visit, they say that we are now moving to a phase, and this is a proper name. They write it with a capital letter in quotation marks: reconciliation on graves. There is also mentioned there that Cyril is particularly interested in paying tribute to the Bolshevik soldiers who marched on Warsaw in 1920. And some celebrations related to this were prepared. I don't know if Cyril went to these battlefields in Ossów near Warsaw. This I don't know. However, these matters are discussed in these documents. The contents of this message was kept secret. It was only announced on the day of the signing. The spirit of saying that there are faults on both sides, that we will fight together now in Europe for Christian values. By the way, it must have been incredibly funny from Cyril's perspective, because it talked to how we will fight together against abortion, precisely for the defense of the life of the unborn, while the Russian Orthodoxy is known for very oppressing pro-life Orthodox priests who actually fight against abortion at a lower level. Never mind. In any case, the message states that the Polish Roman Catholic Church and the Moscow Patriarchate will fight together for the Christian face of Europe, and in a sense, this will become the seed of this great change. Questions about the political dimension of this visit have been asked for weeks, especially since the meetings with the clergy were followed by talks with the highest authorities. A path to dialogue based on the truth, mutual trust, goodwill, and mutual understanding. The nations of Poland and Russia should be together, especially now when our common foundations and common traditions resulting from Christianity are under threat. For the first time, the Russian Orthodox Church signs a document with the Roman Catholic Church. Previously, it had not sent a similar joint message to the followers of any other church. This is not a political declaration, it is a pastoral document. Their message shows that faith calls both nations to abandon the stereotypes formed in the past and to come closer to each other. The visit of the Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia is to be a significant step towards this, and it is high time for it. Here we are dealing with a common document calling churchgoers to enter the path of reconciliation. The most important words were that the agreement was signed due to the high sense of responsibility for the Polish-Russian affairs, and this is not only a religious dimension. The Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia also talked with the Speaker of the Senate, Bogdan Boroshevich. The main topic was the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. Only at the last minute did the public learn the content of the joint document that was finally signed on this occasion. The Polish and Russian nations share the experience of World War II in the period of repression caused by totalitarian regimes. These regimes, guided by atheistic ideology, fought against all forms of religiosity and waged a particularly cruel war against Christianity in our churches. Millions of innocent people were victims, as countless execution sites and graves on Polish and Russian soil remind us. The events of our common, often difficult and tragic history sometimes give rise to mutual grievances and accusations that do not allow old wounds to heal. Perhaps the only explanation for this message, which was signed by Polish bishops with Cyril at the Royal Castle in Warsaw, is that the Polish Roman Catholic signatory of this message, Archbishop Józef Michalik, also has an agent registration. At some stage, the security service treated him as a secret collaborator, codename Zephyr. When Poland was starting to implement the policy of dialogue with Russia as it is, a lawyer, a representative of a company owned by an American financier, was sitting in a Russian prison. It was a moment when the entire Western world was protesting. He was dying in a Moscow prison. Sergei Magnitsky, defender of human rights. In fact, the American and Western European press wrote about how inhumanely someone who simply tried to defend honesty in Russia was treated. Gazeta Wyborcza, in the same issue in which it announced Minister Sikorski's letter today, on the 7th page, on one of the following pages, included information about the imprisonment in Arkhangelsk of a Russian historian who wrote about the Gulag. Sergei Magnitsky worked for Bill Browder, then the largest foreign investor in Russia. I was born in 1964 and, trying to rebel against my communist family, I decided to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. I graduated from Stanford Business School in 1989, the year the Berlin Wall fell, and said to myself, if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall had fallen, I would try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. Eventually, I moved to Moscow. I started an investment fund. It was called the Heritage Fund, and eventually grew to become the largest investment fund in the country, with $4.5 billion assets. I discovered that all the companies I invested in, Gazprom, Sberbank, Surdut, Neftgaz, all these big Russian companies were basically robbed shamelessly by oligarchs or corrupt Russian government officials. The detention of Sergei Magnitsky was an attempt to extort and, as a result, simply take control of all the assets of Browder's company. The operation, which involved billions of dollars, also ended with the murder of a man. Of course, this is a tragedy. We are sorry about that. But hey, don't people die in their prisons? In November 2005, I was expelled from the country and considered a threat to national security. In 2007, police raided my offices in Moscow and confiscated all documents. I hired a young lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, to investigate. He discovered that the documents seized from the office had been used in a complex fraud in which a group of corrupt government officials and organized criminals stole $230 million in taxes from the Russian government. They used our documents to steal their own money. Sergei testified that the officials who were involved. He was then arrested, tortured in prison for 358 days, and then murdered in a Russian custody on the 16th of November 2009. Since then, my mission has been to hunt down the people who killed him and make sure they are brought to justice. And that's what I've been doing for the last 13 and a half years. This has resulted in a piece of legislation named after the lawyer, the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act freezes the assets of and bans visas for people of the Putin regime who committed this terrible crime and who committed other similar crimes. At a very early stage, this campaign also had a completely unknown Polish dimension. In 2010, Bill Browder asked Polish politicians to support the process of adopting the Magnitsky Act in Poland, i.e. the act which, after many years, included sanctions against people of the Russian power, the Russian secret services, people responsible for the death of Sergei Magnitsky, and, as it later turned out, also for the deaths of so many other people. We were conducting research on the Magnitsky Acts in the Polish archive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and found a very interesting document, your letter, your email to one of the members of Parliament who was not in the ruling party at that time, but in the opposition, and was not a member of the government either. I wonder if you remember this email. It's an email to Mr. Ryszard Kalisz, and that's exactly what you're talking about. You asked Polish MPs? Yes, I remember it perfectly. A copy of the letter that Bill Browder sent to Ryszard Kalisz may still be found in the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I hope that, as the chairman of the Justice and Human Rights Committee in the Sejm, you will support an initiative similar to that of the Senator Sardin in the Republic of Poland. The 60 officials responsible for Sergei's death can act with impunity in Russia. Therefore, it is up to other countries to help seek justice for Sergei. A visit to Poland is a luxury that should not be given to those who tortured and killed an innocent man who was only defending his integrity and beliefs. Ryszard Kalisz was a very good man and a good friend. I was introduced to Ryszard Kalisz by former President Aleksander Kwaśniewski, who said, "A certain gentleman wants to meet my friend, Mr. Kalisz." Then he tried to interest the Polish government in the Magnitsky Act, and, as you know, it was just a huge barrier. No chance. Ryszard Kalisz sent the letter received from Bill Browder to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This letter is also still kept in the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As the chairman of the Justice and Human Rights Committee of the Sejm of the Republic of Poland, I'm obliged to ask the minister to take appropriate diplomatic and consular steps in connection with the circumstances of this case. According to Mr. William Browder, the actions of representatives of the Russian authorities raise many doubts as to their compliance with generally accepted international standards of human rights protection. In addition to the letter sent by Bill Browder, the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs also include other letters addressed to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with a request to start on the Magnitsky Act in Poland and to apply sanctions to members of Putin's inner circle and his FSB people. The writings fell on deaf ears. The minister's replies on this matter are dated more than 2 years later than the original letters sent by Browder and Kalisz. The content of the replies addressed to Radosław Sikorski and accepted by him indicates that the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs simply did not want the Magnitsky Act to be implemented in Poland. They wanted to shift this matter to the EU institutions. I think that everyone, the Polish government, the French government, the German government, everyone wanted to cozy up to Putin. Everyone just wanted to have a calm, quiet relationship with Putin. I went to Brussels and I hear that I can't do it here. I have to do it in individual member states. I go to individual member states and they say we can't do it here. You have to go to Brussels. Sorry to interrupt, but this is in response to the email you sent. This email is in English. There are conversations between members of the Polish Parliament and notes prepared for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the conclusion that this should be done at the level of the European Union. In the light of the above, the Eastern Department proposes that, in order to inspire the Danish presidency with the Magnitsky case, this issue should be introduced at COEST in order to discuss the adoption of measures analogous to those applied to the Belarusian regime, such as visa and financial sanctions for persons on the so-called Magnitsky list. Warsaw, 18th of January 2012. It's a bit like the famous Catch-22. Nobody wanted to take responsibility. The deadlock was broken thanks to the US decision. Bill Browder convinced American politicians that it was worthwhile to introduce such regulations. After Sergei Magnitsky was killed in 2009, I set out on a mission to seek justice on his behalf. As I travelled around the world trying to figure out how I can get this justice, I discovered that no one actually wanted to hear what I had to say. I would like to tell everyone that Vladimir Putin is a cold-blooded murderer, a real criminal, a financial criminal, and that he is not the patriot or statesman that people thought him to be. When I went to Washington to lobby for the Magnitsky Act, I was met with great sympathy in the Senate. Senator John McCain, who is no longer with us today, was a great supporter. Senator Benjamin Cardin, a Democrat, was also a big supporter, as were many of their colleagues in the Senate. But the Obama administration put up a huge barrier. A year earlier, something called the Russian reset had been instituted. Hillary Clinton even gave a big red reset button to Sergei Lavrov. America has a very interesting constitution in that the legislative branch, the Parliament, the Congress and the Senate are the branches of its government, equal to the executive branch, the President. Just because I was able to get 92 of 100 senators to vote for this bill, President Obama had to pass it. But he wouldn't have done so if we hadn't had that support. Thus, against Obama's will, we achieved the adoption of the Magnitsky Act in the United States. This was 2012.
To było w 2012 roku.
The Magnitsky Act, with which Big Browder travelled around the world, was intended as a tool to impose sanctions on murderers, thieves from the Kremlin. But because it passed through American Parliament, Congress and Senate, and because of the time it was adopted during the Barack Obama administration, it also became the first hard political tool and law that questioned the entire American reset policy. We will talk about the importance of the Magnitsky Act with the man who physically wrote it. In this building with Kyle Parker.
W tym budynku z Kylem Parkerem.
What is the reason why Russia wanted to interrogate you? Were you part of the Russian investigation? What made you wanted by Russia at that time for transfer to that country as, if I'm not mistaken, one of 10 American civilians?
O ile się nie mylę, jeden z 10 amerykańskich cywili.
I was on this list because I am the one of the staff who is the most associated with writing the Magnitsky Act. which of course introduced the first sanctions we imposed on Russia.
Wprowadziła pierwsze sankcje, jakie nałożyliśmy na Rosję.
From the times of the reset to the times when, as it is hard to imagine in this world after the 24th of February war, but Russia was part of the G8 and was on the way to the OECD membership.
Była na drodze do członkostwa w OECD.
Was part of the Council of Europe, which was almost completely integrated with the Western Commonwealth of Nations.
Wspólnotą narodów.
So they didn't like it. Like our own Barack Obama administration didn't like it, because at the time it thought that those sanctions should be reserved for countries like Iran,
Która
Cuba, or
wtedy
North
sądziła, że
Korea.
te sankcje powinny być zarezerwowane dla takich państw jak Iran, Kuba, Korea Północna.
My and Helsinki Commission Senator Ben Cardin's involvement in the Magnitsky story goes back to early 2009, when Sergei Magnitsky was still alive and Bill Browder first came to Washington to tell his story, which took place this month at this table, where we're sitting now during a meeting like this. Any legislation is always an uphill battle. Back then, the Obama administration was implementing a reset policy.
Każda legislacja jest zawsze bitwą pod górę. Wtedy administracja Obamy dokonywała polityki resetu.
This kind of sweeping the clean baggage of the US-Russian relations immediately after the 2008 Russia-Georgia war. So the legislative policy to not just let the executive branch impose these sanctions, but to force them to act in that way is quite a challenge. It took us the best part of two full Congresses to actually pass the bill. Again, until the last days of the legislative process.
To większą część dwóch pełnych kongresów, aby rzeczywiście przyjąć ustawę i ponownie, aż do ostatnich dni procesu legislacyjnego,
right up until the final days of the legislative process, the
Obama administration was adamantly opposed to such a thing. Adopting the regulations known as the Magnitsky Act in Europe proved even more difficult. I was traveling all over Europe, trying to do something, and people were putting up huge barriers, and there were all sorts of excuses. For example, when I went to the European Commission, they said, "We don't do it at the European level, you have to do it at the member state level." And when I went to the member states, I heard that it should be done at the European level.
You have to do this at the European level.
As a result of this bouncing the ball back, the European version of a major sanctions bill was not created until 2020. Bill Browder tried to convince the countries that were directly affected by Russia's criminal activities to adopt it. It didn't turn out to be so easy. The way I overcame this impasse was very interesting because I went to the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is a very interesting case because it was the country associated with MH17. This is where the MH17 plane came from. As a result of the tragedy, 196 people died. Of what I remember. It was like 11th of September for the Netherlands, this tragedy. So I went to their government and they presented me with this nonsense message. I persuaded several members of their parliament to prepare a resolution calling on the government to propose the EU's Magnitsky Act in Brussels. Officially as the Dutch state, and if they can't do it within the given time, then they will have to come back and introduce the Dutch Magnitsky Act. However, they desperately did not want to pass the Dutch Magnitsky Act, even though they lost about 190 citizens in the terrorist attacks on the plane MH17. But the motion passed with a large majority of votes, and suddenly they had a problem. Finally, they reluctantly went to the European Union and proposed the EU's Magnitsky Act. At this point, I went to Sweden, France and Germany, all of which were also reluctant to introduce their own Magnitsky Acts. They were terribly afraid that they would upset Putin, but in the end, though not fully convinced, they supported the EU's Magnitsky Act. Poland's Magnitsky Act has never been promulgated. The idea that Browder wrote to Kalisz got stuck on the desks of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ultimately, although countries such as Great Britain, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia and the Czech Republic adopted their own Magnitsky Acts in Europe, Poland has never joined this group. The European Magnitsky Act was finally created, but only in 2020 in the EU institutions. It was 11 years after Bill Browder wrote a letter to Ryszard Kalisz. I want to go back to Poland for a moment, because we have a clear case. We know you contacted certain politicians. We know that these politicians have been in contact with their governments. And we know that the government did exactly what you said in other European countries. So do you find any reason why a country could do such a thing, i.e. not be interested in imposing an obvious sanctions law that has been imposed by other countries?
Well, Poland was a very
Cóż, Polska była dla mnie bardzo tajemniczym
Well,
przypadkiem.
Poland was a very mysterious case for me, since Poland is the country that I would have thought would be the most resolute in supporting me on the Magnitsky Act. Poland, as we see with the invasion of Ukraine, is one of the most solid countries in defending Ukraine. But something strange was happening in Poland, and it really became obvious to me after the presidential plane went down and killed the president and various members of this delegation.
the president and various members of his cabinet died. And
This scenario, in a normal world, would lead to war. My point is that the president of the country and his entire staff go to Russia and die in a plane crash. There are many theories about this, but I have to believe it wasn't
going to
an
Russia
accident.
and dying in a
But no
plane
one
crash.
shouted that it was bloody murder. It was all very strange. Why? I mean, why was this thing swept under the rug? I don't understand this.
Dlaczego? To znaczy, dlaczego ta sprawa została zamieciona pod dywan? Nie rozumiem tego.
I don't understand that.
Czy patrząc z twojej perspektywy jesteś w stanie zrozumieć,
From your
że Polska
perspective,
do dzisiaj,
can you
jak
understand
rozmawiamy,
that Poland,
nie
as we
otrzymała
speak,
wraku
has
tego
not
samolotu?
received the wreckage of this plane?
Zawsze popełnia przestępstwa.
Russia always commits crimes unless it is proven otherwise, and the fact that they're keeping evidence makes one thing clear to me, and that's that they're just involved in it. Everyone must understand that there's no difference between organized crime and the Russian government.
And the Russian government.
When the whole world knew that Ukraine would soon be attacked, that bombs would fall on this country, and when everyone expected that Russia would capture Kiev in 3 days and swallow its neighbor, the American administration subjected Nord Stream gas pipeline and the companies operating it to sanctions.
Even in this capital, right? I think it's fair to say that
In this capital, I think it's safe to say that bipartisan majorities in the United States Congress have always understood what Nord Stream is, especially Nord Stream 2.
you know,
I
that
widziały
said,
dokładnie.
And they saw exactly what it entailed.
Spojrzy, jak skompromitowane
Look how
było
discredited the German management was in this matter. I mean, Gerhard Schröder. I mean, could it be any more obvious? Take a look at these favorable industries.
oczywiste. Niech pan spojrzy na te sprzyjające branże.
enabling industry. Why
Why did it take so long? One of the things that have happened recently in the last two or three of interconnections between the Congress and the executive branch has actually been a move by the Congress to sanction the people involved in Nord Stream 2 and to shut it down well before the 24th of February.
Nord Stream 2 i zamknięcie go długo przed 24 lutego. Ale najwyraźniej
But clearly, there was a real desire on the part of the Biden White House to keep the Western coalition united in order to repair the US-German relations.
preserve the unity of the Western coalition, to repair U.S.-German relations?
When the Nord Stream gas pipeline was being built, Jacek Saryusz-Wolski was the head of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. one of the most important committees in this institution. The issue of the Nord Stream gas pipeline and the risks associated with it is something that you in the European Parliament have been dealing with long before it became, let's call it, fashionable, and long before any politicians in the European Parliament understood what these threats were. So what were these threats, and how did you know that the problems would arise from Nord Stream? I remember when it was literally 2 weeks before the Christian Democrats took over the government. After Schroeder, I had face-to-face conversation with Mr. Schauble, urging him to shut it down as soon as he took power, Nord Stream 1. And I heard in response that they were also critical, that they would never do it. But it's too late. It's difficult. It is already running and signed. We know that this was Schroeder's work, his life's work. And then, during the rule of the Christian Democrats, what happened was Nord Stream 2, i.e. all the warnings that it would be a noose around the neck of Europe, especially some countries. Then it was said openly that this war was the road to war. If Ukraine is left alone like this, all this was left out of the entire eastern and energy policy of the European Union, which was, in fact, largely shaped by Germany. That is, Germany plus Austria, the Netherlands, France, and even Great Britain at that time. One of the most important German politicians has a lot to say about this aspect of German policy towards Russia and Poland. A man who, over the years, has held key positions in the German power structure, both here, in the Bundestag, as its president, and the German Ministry of the Interior and Ministry of Finance. I mean Wolfgang Schäuble. Germany cannot make such a decision against its European partners, and our European partners, especially Poland, which is and must be a particularly important partner for Germany. We're against it. Such a decision should not be made by the German government against other countries in Europe. This was my argument already in the case of Nord Stream 1, when Schroeder, from the Red-Green coalition, was still Chancellor. But I think that at that time they were not very interested in geopolitical motives, but in ensuring safe supplies of natural gas for Germany at low prices. I thought it was wrong. I believe that it was a mistake to continue this under Merkel. I thought Nord Stream 2 was a bad project. I even criticised it publicly as a minister in Merkel's government, which did not endear me to the Chancellor. But despite this, I believe that it was primarily about energy policy. However, the geopolitical consequences could later be seen more clearly. The idea was to create, on the one hand, a competitive advantage for the German economy in relation to the export-based economy, a competitive advantage in relation to other economies of European Union member states, and this was to be based on this very cheap and stably supplied gas.
A rzecz miała się opierać właśnie na tym bardzo tanim I stabilnie dostarczanym gazie. To była jedna rzecz.
It was one thing, but this special economic position of Germany, this extra opportunity for development, which, combined with the adoption of the euro, indicated that these economies did not have equal opportunities for the development in this EU situation.
Wskazywało, że te gospodarki w tej sytuacji unijnej nie miały równych szans rozwoju.
That's completely understandable. It is enough to trace what happened after the introduction of the euro in the entire South, including France. Stagnation, right? That's completely understandable. This, however, was to be connected with something that belonged to the political project, that is, taking control of this area from Lisbon to Vladivostok, based on the permanent bond of Germany with Russia and Russia with Germany.
Niemiec z Rosją i Rosji z Niemcami.
Dzisiaj, kiedy powstaje
Today,
film
when this film is
gazociągowy
made, the Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines are not operational. It is not clear who blew them up and how, but it is clear that the company, which was established on the 4th of October 2006 and registered in the Swiss town of Zug, is still operating.
ciągle działa. Kiedy zajrzeć na stronę internetową,
When you look at the website, you will learn that in 2006, after long months of negotiations and preparations by three shareholders on E.ON, the BASF Consortium, and Gazprom founded an independent venture, a design company called Nord Stream.
firmę projektową, która nazwała się Nord Stream. Ta firma funkcjonuje do dziś.
This company still operates today. It is based in the small Swiss town of Zug. The website says that the biggest challenge at the beginning was finding the right office, establishing a company in accordance with Swiss law, and overcoming formal problems. In fact, the biggest problem was something completely different. The fact that the establishment of this company and the location of the gas pipeline of which it became the owner meant that the Russian Federation could pull the energy trigger and start a series of wars, as a result of which, regardless of the fact that it attacked its neighbours and, in accordance with Vladimir Putin's doctrine, rebuilt thanks to this company. This inconspicuous office, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was pumping gas to the West, and billions of dollars were being pumped to Russia, for which Vladimir Putin could buy tanks, bombs, and everything needed to attack subsequent countries.
Bomby i wszystko to, co potrzebne było do atakowania kolejnych państw.
It seems that the company operates normally.
Pomimo nałożenia na Nord Stream,
Despite the sanctions imposed on Nord Stream and despite the fact that the money generated by Nord Stream AG flows into the pockets of the criminal regime that is currently waging an aggressive war in Europe, the company operates uninterrupted, enjoying the security and discretion provided by this small Swiss town. And although the company does not serve customers and it is impossible to talk about what it spends its money on today, it enjoys discreet care. Our visit quickly resulted in the intervention of the first security and the police. And then people who initially pretended to be Swiss or Germans, but when they were forced to switch to their native language, it turned out that they felt most comfortable speaking Russian, and, for some reason, did not want to answer our questions about their names and who they work for. Are you working for the Russians? Yes, my entire life. Are you working for the Russian intelligence? What intelligence? Intelligence, SWR. I do not work for any intelligence. So what is your name? What are you doing? You are filming our headquarters. And for who are you working? Will you tell me? What am I doing? I'm doing what I am told. They drove up to our cars, I think. Come, quickly, we'll run. I want to see what they're doing to our car.
Czy to jest ten pan?
Is it this guy? The most important thing is your face. We're not interested in the rest.
Kiedy jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne to, co nam się przyśni, i wszystkie słowa wypowiedziane, bo jesteś naszym wrogiem.